will begin with our speakers talking through their reflections on what opportunities they're seeing for innovation and technology to enhance the sector, how African companies are leveraging these opportunities, and then they'll talk a little bit about their work and how it enables more African ecosystem players to leverage the opportunities that they've talked about. In terms of the sort of framing for the discussion, many of you on the call will know that in the last few years, different technologies from platforms to artificial intelligence to software for things like gaming or animation, even hardware in terms of things like distribution, are changing the models for creation, distribution, and consumption of content and of creative goods and services. So that's the framing through which they're going to be giving us these reflections. Without further ado, I'm going to first call on Rimini, who's the Director for Market Expansion, xCloud Gaming for Microsoft, to talk about her reflections for 10 minutes, and then we'll come to you, Andrew, to do the same. And then we'll go to Bosun, and then we'll open it up for questions and see how far we can get. In terms of the audience, please feel free to put your questions or comments in the chat as they're speaking, because right after the first set of reflections from them, we will go straight into questions from you. So over to you, Rimini.
In terms of my reflections on the opportunities that I see for innovation, I'm going to focus on the industries in the creative economy that I enjoy the most, which is fashion, music, and film. I'm not going to talk about NFTs or Bitcoin or Web3. If that's why you're listening to me, tune off now. Someone else, I'm sure, in the series will have more insight on that. I'm still learning a lot about that. I'm firmly first generation millennial, so I'm still learning, so I'm still behind there. So I'll start with immersive technology, mixed reality, augmented reality. It's definitely huge. Virtual is definitely huge in fashion. And it's a growing industry. I think in the last 2 or 3 years, we've seen more and more people in the fashion industry and more companies start taking advantage of it. A good example is a fashion designer in the US, Hanifa, who's Congolese, Congolese American, grew up in Congo and moved to the US as a kid. In the middle of the pandemic, during Fashion Week, she decided to have a 3D virtual fashion show. You would assume that this is something that's been done by many people before, but I don't actually think that a lot of people are taking advantage of this technology to immerse their clothing into a 3D format in a black screen and just have them walking like ghosts. It was very timely. It was in the middle of a pandemic. People couldn't go to shows. And people needed to be able to, people didn't stop shopping. That was one of the consistent things during Fashion Week. And they were able to see what the clothes looked like in 3D format. And it was all the rage at the time that she did it. Unfortunately, I haven't seen more people continue to do that per se since that trend started. But I do think that it's something, particularly in Africa, that we should be taking advantage of, because let's face it, fashion shows are expensive to pull off for designers, pulling out collections, paying for models. Of course, that's an entire industry on its own. But with someone with a limited budget, going virtual might probably be an easier way to be consistent in showing their collections. Another thing which we're seeing now a lot is live shopping. Believe it or not, live shopping is not a new concept, right? So if you were around in the 70s or the 80s, you'll remember QVC shopping on TV, where people are holding an item and telling you, oh, look, this bottle of water is Donna Karen, and have people call in and try to buy it. And we're seeing in the last 2 years, it's kind of coming back again. So apparently it's generated about $5.6 billion in the US in 2020. Now, in Africa, live shopping is something that I think a lot of people informally do via Instagram Live, where a lot of vendors are wearing their clothing and dancing and encouraging people to shop via DM. So it has been going on and it's a growing trend. But I think as we see it generating more and more revenue in the West and in China, I think that it's going to become a stronger feature here in Africa as well. Why is it beneficial? You don't need to have a store. Consumers in Africa like to be able to see what they're buying because they don't necessarily trust the online experience of going on a website and looking at a piece of clothing. So when you can see someone model something on Instagram and they can answer your questions directly before you shop, and you can easily interact with them via your DM or take the experience to WhatsApp while watching the video, it will definitely encourage that industry to grow. And that's definitely one technology that I would like to see more African fashion retail businesses or even products just take advantage of. Another immersive technology, which is quite key in the fashion industry, and it's a growing trend, is being able to try clothes in AR. We see a lot of it now, particularly for more bulky looking coat type of clothing, but it's beginning to happen and it's growing stronger and stronger. We're seeing a lot of people getting, well, at least 2 companies have received funding to be able to build out this immersive AR, augmented reality sort of technology to try out clothing. I think that in Nigeria, Nigeria and Africa as a whole, we're still kind of far off from that. But I have come across someone a couple of years ago on Twitter called, I believe it was called Astra as a business. And this was what they were trying to do. They were trying to bring gaming, crypto, and also immersive technology and augmented reality to fashion. I don't know what the state of this company is now. It's been a while since I've been active on Twitter, but perhaps I'll sign in and look for them. But they were talking about the metaverse way before a company named themselves Meta. So you can see that we are kind of on the cusp of leading these emerging technologies here in Africa. So I'll move on to music. Music streaming has changed the way we consume music. Technology has grown immensely for music. I mean, growing up, I had a Walkman. And I remember whenever I went on holiday, it was all about what was the latest Walkman to buy in the stores, the headphones, and then eventually became a Discman. And now it's Spotify and Apple. But let's look at the beginning of this year, where recording artist Kanye West decided to take control of how his music was streamed, right? And he created what was called a stem player, which essentially, if you are familiar with the Walkman, or if you're younger, this is a new concept to you because it's, I would say, a bit like an iPod, but essentially it's a round little disc, which is a bit fleshy to touch. And its main selling point is that you can isolate beats on it. You can mix the vocals. You can just sample it and had different effects to it. And he decided to release his music exclusively on this player. It was $200. It is $200 to buy, slightly expensive. But I think the key takeaway here is that an artist is taking control of how his music is being distributed, and as a result is beginning to reap those benefits. Kanye claims he made over $2.2 million in sales in just one day. How will this apply to us here in Africa? I do think that there are many lessons we can learn here in terms of thinking more creatively as to how we can own our own distribution platforms and how we can make revenue from that. I know a lot of artists are now on Spotify and Apple, and I use these 2 streaming platforms a lot. It's a great way to be accessible to a wider audience. So perhaps still far along the line for us to be thinking of taking advantage of creating our own special technology for music to be consumed, but definitely something to think about, especially when you look at the amount of revenue he's making from it. The other thing that I'd like to touch on is how the creative economy and the platform economy are merging together, right? So it's now redefined the relationship between a creator, between a publisher and a technology company. Essentially, anybody can have their own distribution platform. All you need to do is to go on YouTube and create the Rimini show, right? And have my own audience. Essentially, that's kind of what I'm doing now. Hi, everyone. Welcome to my show. So that as well is one of the key benefits for how technology has changed the way content is distributed. A good example of this is a company, I would say, like xCloud, who is a platform, a publisher, but at the same time, they are content creator as well, right? I enjoy a lot of their articles. I enjoy their memes. I follow them on Instagram, and I still go to their platform at the same time to read some of those interesting human pieces that they create and they write. The second half of your question is, how are Africans leveraging these opportunities? I do think, for example, when we come to film, so I'll move to film there, technology has democratized filmmaking. You don't need to have a big budget. You don't need to have a huge studio backing you. Literally, all you need is a device. And with your device, you can edit films. In essence, you can become a filmmaker once you use Instagram Reels or TikTok, because it has rudimentary editing software. So by the very definition, if you've ever made a TikTok video, if you've ever made an Instagram reel, you qualify as a filmmaker. And this is such a wonderful thing that tech has done. And how have I seen it working and giving opportunities in Africa? The examples are, we see them every day, right? The boys from Kaduna, the critics that rule, using just very rudimentary software and devices, they were able to get the attention of J.J. Abrams, who was the director of Star Wars and Lost, and also produced Westworld. That's huge. The Ikorodu boys here in Lagos, who were also at the Oscars, their skits are pretty popular. Everyone enjoys that content, and they featured at the Oscars. And all of this is because of how technology has democratized filmmaking. And finally, I think, how are we on time? Am I still under 10 minutes?
Yeah, you can round off, it's fine.
Okay. Finally, from a gaming perspective, the work that I do is I work for xCloud, which is essentially cloud gaming, Xbox cloud gaming. And we are taking the console experience and moving it to the device. Africa is hugely mobile led. And for cloud gaming, this is a huge opportunity. In a 2021 study commissioned by Newzoo, we've seen that the rise of gaming in Africa is phenomenal. We've risen to about 186 million gamers. This is up from 77 million in 2015. African Games Week just held in Cape Town last month. And from it, there was a coalition of African gaming publishers and content creators called the Pan-African Gaming Group, I believe. And they are going to be a coalition of African countries and gamers who want to take charge of growing the gaming industry by double every year. So there's definitely an opportunity there. There's an opportunity to create more relevant African content. Research has shown, though, that a lot of the content that we create in gaming in Africa mimics Western gaming content. So we're not necessarily creating indigenous games in our storytelling. And there's a huge opportunity there to create content which Africans will resonate with Africans and we will enjoy. But not just that, we would be able to export these stories to platforms like ours and others. I am seeing a lot of interest in Africa, not just from Xbox. We've just recently hired African manager for Xbox. A person sits out of Nigeria. I've also seen NVIDIA is doing the same as well. They've hired someone to manage Africa. And when things like this start happening, it means that you're going to see more and more multinational players coming into the ecosystem to work together with the local players to grow the industry. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Rimini. I can see a comment in the chat from Kenneth Church, but we'll go to Andrew Missingham first, and then we'll come to the comments in the chat and the questions. Over to you, Andrew.
The first thing is to say I've just come back literally yesterday from time in Nigeria and Ghana and Kenya to try and understand the adoption of blockchain-enabled technologies across sub-Saharan Africa. And I came very skeptically. I came skeptically not of Africa, but skeptical of blockchain technologies, because the most compelling use cases in the West seem to be around speculation, both at the top and the bottom of the market. Blockchain has been called in the West a solution awaiting a problem. That's not really what I've encountered in Nigeria and Ghana and Kenya. I found real problems and some real solutions where blockchain seemed to be the only thing. So I'm going to deal with some of those first. The most compelling use case that I've seen is international payments, and actually not just international payments, but mobile money integration, mobile money being a really clear example of an African leading technology. Back, from 2006-07, the advent of M-Pesa with Safaricom in Kenya, it still leads the West in terms of mobile money integration. So actually having blockchain technologies which not just allow international transfer, cash transfer from the West to sub-Saharan Africa, and then intra-African money transfer, really gets rid of a lot of problems. And blockchain-enabled technologies, for example, send cash in Nigeria, and then yellow card all over. Basically, that solves a real problem. And so it allows people to not just trade crypto as people do, in the West, but to trade full stop, be that for, creative products and services like artwork, be that for services that people can offer, like, web development or even the creation of services like graphic design. The next area I'm going to deal with, which I think is really interesting, is I'm going to broadly call it transparency. And when I talk about transparency, this is about kind of accountability as well. And what blockchain technology can do is it can enable people to be able to hold and track, for example, ownership. And this is important in areas like property, where proving the ownership of property can be, very difficult. It can be held only on an oral agreement or something like that, and actually, so having something like putting your property deeds on a blockchain, where they're immutable, where they can be instantly accessible, that stuff is very exciting. So businesses like House Africa that Mambi Uba created in Nigeria, I think that those things are the future. Those are really, really exciting. And you can see instantly with that, this idea of proving and tracking ownership has got almost universal applications. One's again in in sub-Saharan Africa, where both you have infrastructural frailty in terms of the judiciary, in terms of the legal system, and the ability to track ownership and payments. You can see this also in the creative sector, working for intellectual property too. The next area I'm excited by, and I think is really interesting, is networking, innovation, and education. These aren't necessarily blockchain enabled, but they are nonetheless exciting ways of bringing creatives together. And so I'm sure you all know about the AfriLabs network. AfriLabs is it's a network organisation supporting innovation centres across 51 countries in Africa. And I was like, well, actually, when I met Nekesa Weri in Nairobi, who's the head of strategy at AfriLabs, I said, it would be quicker just to tell us the 4 countries you're not in, So, it's these hub service kind of centres that provide support for African entrepreneurs, innovators, developers, and youth. And with that sort of networking, that is massively, massively powerful. And so it's like a network and a network of networks. So the ability to basically cross-pollinate ideas, knowledge sharing, creativity, skills. This is something which is really, really going to be massively important for Africa in the future. And as Rimini alluded to, the ability to do to do that in the creative sector as well is massively important. The other one I went to, I went again to MEST, to the Meltwater organisation in Accra. What that's great for is education of tomorrow's entrepreneurs. So, MEST has got this year-long, full-time, fully sponsored intensive program to create entrepreneurs in training, and they then can graduate and get help and seed capital and be incubated. And so being able to help and capacity build entrepreneurs, creative entrepreneurs like that, is massively important. The next last two areas I'm going to deal with, one is value in supply chain, being able to not just improve value in the supply chain, but shorten it as well. Africa is a resource-rich continent which has suffered at the hands of very often the West, in terms of middlemen, and they normally are men, taking disproportionate amounts of the proceeds of producers' wealth, and this goes pretty much with almost any resource. The organisation or the business Twigger Foods, TWGIA Foods, I'll put that in the chat as well. It's fascinating. What they do is they simplify the supply chain between fresh food producers, manufacturers and retailers through a B2B e-commerce platform. And that removes the need for many intermediaries who normally they're and it significantly works on both sides. It significantly lowers the cost of food for consumers, and it increases the margins for the food producers themselves. And they do that by basically creating a longer value chain. So whereas if you're like a lady selling bananas, in the old days used to go and any rotten bananas they'd throw away. And so Africa's got an incredible, food waste proportion of about 45-50%. Whereas if you had a service that basically created a longer value chain, and they said, no, that's okay, we'll take those bananas that you don't sell back and we can basically turn them into banana bread, or we can use them as an ingredient in soap or whatever. You basically elongate that value chain and you cut the cost. That sort of stuff is massively important. And the last thing, of course, is not at an individual level. It's at a business, it's at a policy level. I think that with the African Union and the idea of creating a free trade area across Africa, that's massively important, and that's going to need policy innovation. I was lucky enough to meet with Professor Bitangi Ndemo from the University of Nairobi, who is the senior advisor to the Kenyan government and other governments as well on ICT. And Professor Ndemo's latest report into blockchain and AI is absolutely great. It's a really, really pivotal piece of work. And if all you really need to know about Professor Ndemo is he was the architect of the Kenyan ICT report in 2007 that basically led to the explosion of mobile money across the continent. So that's some of the stuff that's interesting me. And you can see it goes right from the top of policy all the way down to the bottom to real grassroots education and grassroots support. And that's me, gentlemen.
Thanks, Andrew. So I know you've got to leave, Andrew. Thanks for all the people on the call. Andrew has put some useful links in the chat. If you can stay for any additional minutes, that would be great. But if not, we'll let you go quietly. We'll go to, before we call Bosun, we'll go to the comments in the chat. I see that somebody, Kenneth Church, had said in the chat when you were speaking, Rimini, that the downside in terms of what you were describing there about content is a drop in quality. And they were saying that their colleague refers to it as too much content, reducing the value or the worth of the industry. And I just wondered, Rimini and Andrew, if you're able to say, what are your reflections on that, striking that balance between the ease of being able to create content and what it does for quality and the value and the worth? So Andrew, if you want to go first. Yeah,
I'll go first. And by the way, everybody, I'll put my own contact details in the chat if you need to keep in touch with me. I think it's a very simple one. Kenneth, I agree with you to a certain point, and then I disagree. The agreement is there seems to be a lot more low quality around, but the disagreement is because there's always been low quality around. You just haven't been able to see it or access it. Digital connection makes it much, much easier for you to be able to see all content and to be able to become producers and produce and share their stuff. I actually think that excellent content is as rare as it's ever been. It's always rare to create something truly excellent. I think that, the bad news, it's kind of, because there's a lot of noise and a lot of clutter, it's harder to see it. The good news is, because everybody can see the excellent stuff, everyone can be inspired by it and can learn from it, and therefore can, it's like YouTube University is an amazing thing, right? Yes, there's rubbish lessons out there, but you can learn pretty much anything on YouTube now for free, as long as you've got the money to pay for a connection. So I kind of agree and disagree. And then I'm going to go, John and everybody, thank you very much. I'm sorry I had to leave. It's been a real treat.
Thanks, Andrew. For those on the chat, Andrew mentioned he's put his information in the chat, so you can find that if you go to the chat. Over to you, Rimini. Do you want to reflect on that point from Kenneth Church about quantity versus quality and so on?
So in that regard, I think I disagree with you. I think that there is content for everybody, and it's subjective, right? So what you think is low quality, someone else might think it's great. I think you should focus more on the content that interests you. It's such a vast thing. We can't stop people from creating, neither can we prescribe guidelines by our own beliefs or what we enjoy, so to speak. Because a lot of skits I see on the internet are not necessarily my thing, but if I look at the comments and the amount of likes that it gets, it is the thing of millions and millions of people. If I gauge the quality, I think people need to work with what they have available. And you find as resources and tools become available to people, they improve. If you look at our film industry, particularly when I talk about the film, I'm talking about the Nigerian film industry. Think about the Nollywood films of the early 90s. The amount of the graphics and the amount of just the way it looked then and the way it looks now, with access to technology, access to more budgets, it's completely changed. But we loved and enjoyed it then. And even now, that accounts dedicated to nostalgia that still wish to have that element of Nollywood come back, as caricature as it is, people enjoy that content. There's Nollywood Babes on Instagram and a couple of other pages that are dedicated to 90s nostalgia Nollywood and enjoy that content, which someone else might look at and subjectively say, this is low quality. This is low content. So I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Rimini. That's very interesting. I've had lots of really interesting debates, also in the Nollywood context, where some people are arguing for higher production value. We need to be more like Hollywood. And other people like me are saying, look, we can't out Hollywood. We need to be, it's not saying do bad production values. It's just the thing that people are watching and enjoying is often the story, the how they can relate to what is being said because the context is relevant. And that aligns with what you're saying about, people, it's about an aesthetic, right? And an aesthetic is very, very subjective. And so different people enjoy different things. So thanks for that, Rimini. I'm going to go now to, we'll come back to questions in a second. But I'm going to go to Bosun, who is the Chief Executive of Co-Creation Hub. And Bosun will give us his opening sort of statements, responding to the point about what trends you're seeing in terms of innovation and technology application in the African creative economy, what you're seeing African companies doing in that regard, and a little bit for the people on the call about how they, as creative entrepreneurs and people wanting to get into the African creative economy, can leverage innovation and technology to enhance their businesses. Over to you, Bosun.
So talking about technology and how technology is disrupting humanity generally, I think for me, it's the same across board. Of course, it's then unique to application area, depending on which sector you play. I think some of the things to bear in mind or take into consideration, one is the processing power, the shared processing power that we have today that we didn't have before. So days when, if you're recording a video, for instance, so you imagine all those cameras that used to be based on whatever tape they record on, and how many of them you will need. You're going to a wedding event. How many of those you will need to change and all of that. I think we're at a time now where, because things are on one hand based on cloud, and also because the devices have a strong processing power, I think that gives the chance for people to be able to create extremely exciting content that I think we're even not scratching the surface on yet. So when you start to talk about mixed reality, those things are possible because we can now process, content at a level that is currently unprecedented. I think another one that is big is the fact that the current digital technology, particularly through internet, gives us the chance to connect people to people way faster than we've ever seen before. The fact that if I create a content today, I can share it with tons of people without needing any special, equipment or devices to do that. And they can also take it on as well and interact with it. I think that's also been big for the creative economy, not only in Nigeria, I think across board, to be honest. But what we're beginning to see, which is also exciting, that I think we're still not open to yet on the continent, is the fact that you can also connect people to machines, right? Which means you can, you as an individual, you have a machine, you can use it to create content, push it to another machine that is remote, a single machine that a mass amount of people can actually have access to. I think that's also disrupting really, really significantly. Broadly, when you look at what this means for creatives, I think you're looking at the fact that these technologies are beginning to also cut out a lot of middlemen or middle players in that sense. The days where you needed to hire a special company to help you do your short video, if you can really get on it yourself and get going. Even seeding those content into platforms where people will get to see them. If you're creative, you don't need all of those anymore. We see what is happening on things like TikTok, but also Instagram as well, where people create and they push their content from one to many. So that opportunity to be able to push content from one to many, I think is also big. So you find that the middlemen now need to have strong offers for creative for them to be truly relevant. If you see a creative that is entrepreneurial and innovative, which comes by nature in some cases, the innovative bit, not entrepreneurial bit, I think you'll find that it's easy for them to reach their audience. The other bit I think is also exciting is the fact that you can also actually interact with your audience, and you can create this content and your product in such a way that people can not only consume it, they can interact with them as well. Right, which gives massive opportunity for feedback. And that comes in so many ways, from basic things like analytics. So if you see people that are really smart, there's so many analytics tools that you can use to better understand how your users or consumers are reacting to your content. And that can then help you give some sort of direction to what you create in future, where you put your resources as well. Instead of just firing blank or waiting for hard stuff to inform your decision in terms of how you create, that opportunity is there. If you see people that are really smart as well, you can also actually collect, beyond analytics data, you can collect real-time feedback from people as they engage your content. So some of the things we've seen will be, I think what Rimini was talking about, when she was saying there are content that she doesn't dig, for instance, but millions of people into them. But you see comments on these things, and those comments, if you see a smart creative who can actually use data science really well, you can extract them, you can extrapolate the content, and you can even do deep level analysis of social network analysis on the content as well. Because if you know the people that are constantly consuming your content, there are tools today, slightly advanced, probably not available to everyone, but at least you can analyze the network of the people who consume your content. And through that analysis, you know who else to target to be able to grow your reach. So it's endless. I don't know how many minutes I've got for this, but I think, the biggest part when you're thinking about it is that unprecedented opportunity for human to connect to humans from so many places. So you're in a village in Ijebu, you can connect with millions of people all over the world. So you can imagine that the opportunity and what is possible there is endless. It's endless.
Thanks very much, Bosun. I really like what you were saying about data and insights. People often don't realize this, but all of the big streamers like your Netflix and Amazons, they're using a lot of our data to do like recommender systems, like if you watch this, then you will probably like this. All the data in the back end that they're looking at and saying, what are people watching the most? Is it the character? Is it the arc of the story? And they're using that data it's almost like making us addicted because they can anticipate what we would like based on our watch history. And so not a lot of people know that or think about it, but it's a really valuable way to get customer insight. So thanks for that, Bosun. I see that there's comments, some comments still in the chat and questions. So I'll just invite people to, in the next 15, 18 minutes or so before we end the call, to put their questions and comments in the chat. We've got one, and while we have you, Rimini, I'm just going to come to you first, and then I'll come back to you, Bosun. But there's a question from John N., who I think is in Kenya, who's asking, why are commercial banks or conventional banks afraid and shy of funding innovative ideas and intellectual property like patents? In your experience, I know that you're a lawyer, Rimini, so you can probably talk a little bit about that.
You came to me first for this question. Honestly, this is not a question that I'm willing to attempt to answer. I think that perhaps I'll give a more broad answer to it. A lot of more traditional systems, and I'm talking banks, I'm talking governments, are more stuck in legacy ways of thinking, right? And one of the things that I tell them in my work in policy is always that technology will always evolve before the law, before any government, before any financial banking system. And as a result, they need to be more open to the idea of being more progressive. So I'm not sure that they're afraid or shy, but I think there's a lack of knowledge per se, which when you lack knowledge in something, it becomes threatening. And it's not a criticism, because collectively as an industry, I would say, Ojoma, Bosun, even myself, we need to be able to teach people what they do not know. So often when you see a knee-jerk reaction to a regulation, it's out of fear. It's not necessarily because they're trying to stem innovation, it's because they don't understand it. So we have a duty. And sometimes we say, why should we be the ones teaching people? But we should be, because we are the ones creating those products. We are the ones consuming those products. And we are the ones who understand those products beyond the people in legacy. And so if we collectively come together as an industry, host workshops, host best practices, we can actually upscale the way commercial banks think, the way governments think, and bridge that gap. So I know it's a broad answer because I'm not.
Well, it is a good answer. I completely agree with you about regulation following innovation. And Bosun can probably talk a little bit more about this. So it was a good answer. Over to you, Bosun.
No, absolutely. Spot on answer as well. So the regulation bit that Rimini was talking about, I think extends beyond funding, to be honest. And that's why I always say, I'm in tech. I've seen over the years, governments come up with things that we find really appalling and disruptive. But what I always say to people is, in Nigeria, for instance, Nigerian government is not anti-innovation. Nigerian government is very pro-innovation, right? The only thing Nigerian government is not is that Nigerian government, what they don't know, right? They get defensive about it, right? So if they see something happening that they don't have a clue and they can't explain it, the first thing they will do is to use regulation to sort of keep it on the side. And I think cryptocurrency is a good example in Nigeria. Even with all the things that CBN has been doing, Nigeria is almost like still the second destination for it in the world, right? But coming to investment, I think the real issue with investment is that we always forget that the money that investors invest, they come from other investors, right? So if you take banks, for instance, the money that banks are investing, they are the deposit that you and I are putting there. So the source of their capital is what determines how they invest. It's not because they don't know. And we're quick to judge on this. Even if you go to the West, you're not going to see banks funding startups easily. But access to loan in the West is high. So when people say they use bank funding from banks in those climes to support their businesses is typically based on the fact that whether it's for your business or not, the bank can give you $10,000, $20,000 based on your credit history, right? So they know that this person is consistent. This is how much you earn. Over time, we're going to be able to get our money back, right? In Africa, that's not the case. Most countries don't have such records, right? So that's the starting point. So it's not clear who to hold accountable. So you'll find that most of the banks are investing in things that can be collateralized, right? So they know that if they give you the money, it goes into something, there's something they can get back, right? Which is why they will always ask you for that. Say you ask them to invest in a creative business or a tech startup, it's high risk. That's the kind of money they have to disburse is not for things like that. And that's why you start to see the VCs are made for that, right? Folks who invest in funds, who invest in startups, people who know that it's high risk. You know, if you invest in 10, we just need only one to be successful. And if that one is successful, we're going to make it. But banks can't do that because for VCs, right, the way it works is that they have a period for which the money needs to come back, right? So if, for instance, they invest in 10 companies and the first 9 is not bringing anything back, but the last 10 bring something back in 8 or 9 years' time, they're fine. Because the people who gave them the money, you typically have a period, you know, when your money needs to come back. And it's somewhere, I think the minimum you get is 8 or 10 years. But for the banks, they're using deposits, right? So you can turn up tomorrow and say you want your money back. So if they're giving loans to people and they have that level of, you know, there's a name for it in banking, but they have that level of default. Yeah? Where 9 out of 10 people are defaulting. There's nothing they're going to say to their customers who save the money with them. So I think that's the issue. You've seen cases where government intentionally give them money to actually loan out to businesses. And when you see that, they actually do that as well. So I think what we need to start to see more, if we want the banks to participate, is also going to go back to what Rimini was talking around regulations. How can we ensure that government is also intentional to use these financial institutions to support them with the right policies that will allow them put certain funds into creative economy and tech startups? Because if government is not doing that, banks will just be buying bonds. You know, they're sure that bonds will bring back their money. And sometimes it's even government bonds that they'll buy, right? They buy the bonds, they get the money back, they make their money, everyone is happy. So it's about risk.
Yeah. If I could add to that, actually,
Sure.
and because I'm a friend to the government, so to speak. I mean, I've worked with governments closely across Africa, so I've seen different patterns. But I'll zero in on the Nigerian government. So you have, I believe it's BFI. What are they called? The one here in Nikon. Oh, I just had the name.
BOI.
There you go. BOI. BOI has a fund which is dedicated, I think, to film, and another one which is for fashion, where they're giving out loans and investing in these businesses. And the interest rates, I don't think, are that high. The Nigerian government at some point was supporting Nollywood. They had a thing, and this was during the previous administration, Jonathan, was called Project Act, where they were giving grants to filmmakers to create movies. It wasn't a loan. It was a grant. All you needed to do was submit a proposal. It was evaluated. If you met the criteria, it was being dispersed. So in many ways, sometimes the government is proactive to certain industries. In the financial industry, of course, I definitely agree with everything Bosun said. Fear, I think, is the leading factor in it. And as an industry, we have to collectively come together to know when and how to advocate for things and where we come in to help before people have the knee-jerk reaction of giving a regulation. So we need to get in front of it before a regulation is issued. And I think we're seeing that in circumstances like artificial intelligence, where all AI experts say AI does need to be regulated, just not now while it's still being explored. So there is an opportunity for the ecosystem to start thinking about AI ethics and just the different things which we would like to see in a regulation, and start kind of consulting with the governments to help shape the final product of what will regulate the industry.
Thanks, Rimini. I think what you guys are saying there about instruments is critical, like instruments for funding. I've done lots of analysis in different contexts where we say the creative industries are working and supported. And the reality, as Bosun was saying, is that banks anywhere typically are not funding startups or high risk in quote businesses that are based on intellectual property as the collateral. And you were talking about grants there, if there's a continuum of types of funding, you have grants on one end and you have debt, which is what banks provide. On the other extreme, in between, there's so many other types of funding that should exist: angel investments, private equity, VC funding, all of these things. And I feel like it's that lack of maturity of that middle of the funding pipeline that's making us rely so much on banks for the funding for these sectors. And so what you're describing there about regulation and support innovation from governments to develop different types of instruments that enable the right types of investments is exactly what is needed. Debt is only one element. Even when you're making a film, like, debt is the last source of funding that you're looking for, because who knows if a film will succeed or not? Like, you can make some bets based on the cast, the director, their previous record, but who really knows? And so for something that you don't know, taking a loan that you have to pay back is also a bit crazy. So the model is what Bosun was describing there, where you have a portfolio, two may work and they'll cover the cost of the others. But debt as an instrument can't help you do that. So I think that's a really critical thing. And John from Kenya says, great answer on banks funding innovative ideas. There was also, I think we have time for one last comment and question, and it's really about South Korea. I see that you've put something in the chat, but I think lots of people are talking about how the South Korea filmmaking model, content making model is really interesting. What are your reflections on that, Rimini?
So I guess my answer in the chat was, I don't think that we are doing much differently. Well, South Korea is doing something very different. South Korea is telling more uniquely South Korean stories, right, which resonate. They're not trying to, and this is back to your comment of we can't out Hollywood. They're not trying to be Hollywood. I think one key takeaway that we got from an industry viewing of one of my brother's films a couple of years ago was they find that African or Nigerian films tend to try and create a more Hollywood type of dialogue, which is not necessarily rooted in the reality that we live in. And you can't criticize this and say a lot of American films are dystopian and they're based in space or 2020, 2053, and we aren't there yet. So why do they expect us to only do films based in our reality? But the truth is, people are interested in knowing what it's like to live in Nigeria, what it's like to live in Kenya. People want to know how the average Nigerian lives. People want to know what a wealthy Nigerian home looks like, right? And if you have a script which is somewhat leaning towards an American sort of thing, it's not any different from the films that they're seeing in Nollywood. And I think for what I've seen from content from K-drama, for the movies from South Korea, I mean, look at Squid Game. That was, if you can actually put that in the Nigerian context, because we live that sort of cutthroat life on a daily basis, right? What kind of unique story can we tell that can upgrade us to that level? There is a lot of interest in our Nigerian content. And I think by and large, we're doing really well as Nollywood, but we haven't gotten to the level of global acceptance as our music has. And remember, the music, we didn't start overnight. When I was much, much younger, I worked in the music industry. And I remember all of the big artists when they were starting and how Nigerian music wasn't really being played on Nigerian radio. In fact, it was the NBC that issued a directive for Nigerian radio stations to ensure that for every international song you play, you must play 2 Nigerian songs. And at the time, we didn't even have enough Nigerian content. So as a result, we ended up playing a lot of African music. So Manu Dibango, etc., all those other artists, Miriam Makeba, we had to mix all of that because we didn't have Nigerian music or enough Nigerian music. And then the industry started to grow because, believe it or not, the government was a catalyst by issuing this directive to radio stations to ensure that our music started growing. I left Nigeria, and by the time I came back, all I could hear on radio stations was D'banj, Why Me, Coco Master, and it was incredible. No one listened to American music anymore. Nigerian music had taken over. And I think that it took a while. Now we're seeing international collaborations with Justin Bieber and everyone else. We're going to get there with our film industry. We'll take time, but we'll get there. And I see it happening.
Thanks very much, Rimini. As you were speaking, I remembered I was reading an interview of, I think it's the head of content relations or something at Boomplay. And she was reflecting on this very thing that you're talking about, which is we need to be listening to more local content. And she was giving the example of Nigeria, where she's saying, in terms of their data that they're seeing in the back end, what Bosun was talking about, lots of Nigerians listen to Nigerian music elsewhere. And she specifically was mentioning Kenya, for example, and saying what they're seeing in Kenya, for example, is that not that many Kenyans are listening to Kenyan music. And so it's like, how do you stimulate that mind shift? And you've just given us a very good example where regulation can actually force certain behaviors that lead to sectors thriving. And we've certainly seen that in music. Over to you, Bosun.
No, so yeah, I'm not an expert there, but there's something as well that I think whenever this conversation is up that we're probably missing. And I'd love that someone would take the time to actually dig into it. I've heard something around Mr. Easy or someone and how they use data to determine the sound that they actually produce. And I think that's something that may be coming out more from Nigeria that we're ignoring as well. So there's the part where you can use policy to increase airtime for local content. But if people still don't, especially today, because people don't have to listen to radio to consume their content, right? If you look at the last 12 or 18 months, you see how many Nigerian songs made it onto as Instagram or TikTok that are being used for background stuff and people are performing to. I think it's also how people feel, the vibe they get from the sound. And I think, again, talking about data, I think data is mature to the point where people can actually predict what kind of sound will get a reaction. I've heard in the Nigerian space that this is becoming a thing where people are actually studying the trend and they're using to do matchups to determine what their beat is going to be like. And that may, if it's true, I don't have data to back this up, that may also be responsible for the spread that we're seeing with Nigerian music. And I think if other countries are trying to copy, when Nigeria did what we did with policy, internet wasn't this ubiquitous. Today, that you say the radios must play Kenyan music may not actually imply that people will listen. Because people still consume from non-radio platforms that nobody can control. But I think if we bring data into it, I think, and this is my proposition, I was having this conversation with someone last week, when the person was saying, we've seen South Africa before Nigeria, they think it's going to move to another country. But my response was, if the space in Nigeria keeps growing and data keeps becoming a part of it, I think it's going to be difficult for anyone to push it away. Because you can understand your consumers better. And the more you understand your consumers, the more you can actually produce content that will last for a lifetime.
Absolutely. Thanks, Bosun. I'm going to come to you, Rimini, to give us your final thoughts. So there's entrepreneurs on the call that are either already working in the African creative economy or want to break in. What 2 or 3 top tips do you have for them as it relates to applying technology or using innovation in their businesses and in their sector?
My closing note will borrow from what Bosun just said, because it is quite key. Data insights. As any technology company will tell you, we have teams dedicated to analytics and insights. For a creative coming in, I think that data is key for you to understand your customer, understand demand, and understand how your competitors or even your peers in the industry are moving and how you can improve and be better. I think that also one of the things that we should be taking advantage of is access to easy to use technology platforms. If you're in retail, look at the insights once more, which will show you that, and this is, I spoke to someone in fashion retail in the UK a couple of months ago who was giving me insights on the trends that they've seen for what generates sale. And for them, Facebook and Google generated more sales than Instagram. And so if you are a retailer, these sort of data insights are very helpful for you to think about how you should be marketing your product and where you should show up. So take advantage of these tools, I would say. And lastly, of course, the cloud exists, and the cloud is the reason why we're having this conversation. Zoom is running on the cloud. The cloud has given us access to every sort of technology. So to just make sure that you are plugged into the cloud and you're taking full advantage of all the benefits of it to be able to grow in the creative economy. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rimini. I'll summarize that by saying no more inshallah and vibes. We actually need to do the research and get the data. Over to you, Bosun, for your final 2 or 3 tips for people on the call.
I don't know if it'll be 2, but I think, we live in a world that is heavily connected, right, due to digital technologies. And what we keep forgetting is that content is actually the, is it the blood that I'm going to call it, or what? That is the fuel that is actually driving the digital economy, right? Whether it's content in terms of people purchasing stuff or people consuming digital content, there's got to be something that people are exchanging. And I still think the biggest challenge we have is the line between the creative economy and the technology space, right? For me, if you look at it deeply, I think they're the same, right? They're the same. It's just that one is building the infrastructure. The other is building what is actually making that infrastructure to be appealing to people. If you look at the folks who make mobile phones, for instance, imagine all these smartphones that we have today, without all the fantastic apps that we have on them, whether it's supplying news to you, or it's Instagram where you're sharing creative content, or you're streaming music, or you're watching video through YouTube. So everything I've described without the creative space is useless. You can have that technology itself, and it won't make sense. So I think, the key thing I would love to drop is that folks in the creative economy needs to start to see that the line, that there's no line really. You're just an extension or a part of the digital technology space. You're a different side of that coin. And it is important that as you do what you do, you start to look for ways to actually engage, the technology space, find ways in which you can have a better understanding of how things are developing. When we're talking about, whether it's cryptocurrency or the whole idea of Bitcoin, how that can be used by creative, or even the technology that is powering that in the first place, and how you can also use that within the creative economy. When we talk about Web3, or the entire story around Web3, again, is the same thing. Without the creative, it's totally useless. When we talk about metaverse that everyone is positioning for, right? You see Facebook is spending a whole lot of money to try and build metaverse because they believe that that's where we're going to exist in future. They don't want you to physically travel to Paris, but you can still experience Paris with your friend that is in Nigeria while you're in Kenya. But no one is going to make that happen without the creative economy, because the content that will make that thing look real is going to come from the creatives, right? So I think once you understand this, then you understand the power that you have, that the digital economy that we're seeing is not real without the creative economy.
100%. Thank you, Bosun. I've also just dropped a link in the chat. It's a report that was just recently published by UNESCO saying exactly what you're saying, Bosun, which is the digital economy is indistinguishable from the creative economy because they're, for all the reasons that you described. So on that note, I just want to say thank you to you, Rimini. Thanks to Andrew, who's now left, and thanks very much to you, Bosun. And thanks to everyone who has dialed in. We did record the call and we will post the recording online so you can come back to it. And for people on the call, this is a quarterly series. There's also mentoring available. So we will send you links to register to get more tailored advisory or answer more specific questions about how you can leverage different types of technologies that have been talked about in your own business and in your own practice. So thanks very much, everybody. My colleague Toby is going to put a link in the chat. You can join our Facebook group where we will share the recording, but where we will also be sharing things like some of the links that have been put in the chat, but also various other tools and opportunities that people can leverage to grow their use of technology and innovation. Thanks, everyone, and see you again soon.